Marcus's small hand still held the toy airplane when the sound of the slap echoed through the cabin. Passengers froze. An 8-year-old child, struck across the face by the very woman meant to ensure his safety. His cheek burned red, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. The flight attendant's glare carried no regret, only authority, as if daring anyone to challenge her. But what she didn't know was who Marcus's father was, or the storm her action had just unleashed. Because with one phone call, this flight would turn from routine to historic. Marcus Washington was just 8 years old, but to his family, he was the heart of everything. Bright-eyed, curious, and endlessly fascinated by airplanes, he had been looking forward to this flight for weeks. His small backpack was packed the night before, filled with coloring books, snacks, and that one toy airplane he never let go of. For Marcus, flying wasn't just about getting somewhere, it was an adventure. He had memorized every detail of the aircraft, from the shape of the wings to the safety announcements he could almost recite by heart. Beside him sat his older sister, Zara, who at 14 had inherited her father's calm confidence. While Marcus buzzed with excitement, Zara kept her eyes on him, protective in the way only an older sibling could be. She had seen how people sometimes looked at their family in public, curious stares that could quickly shift into something darker. Growing up as the children of Solomon Washington, one of the most successful black businessmen in the world, meant always being under a spotlight. Sometimes admiration, sometimes envy, but far too often suspicion. And then there was Solomon himself. In the business world, his name carried weight that few could rival. A man who had turned bold ideas into a trillion-dollar empire. He was a symbol of what was possible when brilliance and resilience met opportunity. But to his children, he was simply Dad, the man who read bedtime stories, who cooked pancakes on Sunday mornings, and who always told them to stand tall in a world that would try to make them small. For Solomon, this flight was supposed to be uneventful. Just another trip, another meeting on the other side of the country. He had worked tirelessly to shield his children from the uglier truths of racism, wanting them to enjoy childhood without always carrying the weight of prejudice on their backs. But as every black parent knows, that shield can only hold for so long. The Washingtons boarded the plane like any other family. Marcus clutched his toy airplane, Zara held their boarding passes, and Solomon gave a polite nod to the flight attendants. To most passengers, they were simply another family traveling together. But to one member of the crew, they were something else, something to be judged, dismissed, and treated as less. At first, it was subtle. The dismissive tone when Solomon asked a question. The long, suspicious look at Marcus's backpack during boarding. A muttered comment that wasn't meant to be overheard. Solomon noticed, but he let it slide. Years of experience had taught him to pick his battles, to keep his composure even when disrespected. But prejudice rarely stays hidden for long. What began as quiet hostility would soon become open aggression. And before the cabin doors were closed, Marcus Washington, an 8-year-old boy who only wanted to play with his toy airplane, would find himself at the center of a storm no one could have predicted. The plane hummed with the soft rhythm of passengers settling in. Bags overhead clicked shut, safety announcements played in the background, and Marcus leaned against the window, tracing invisible patterns on the glass with his finger. To anyone else, it was the calm before takeoff. But for the Washington family, an unsettling current had already begun to stir. Victoria Reed, the senior flight attendant assigned to their section, carried herself with an air of authority that felt more like dominance than service. Tall, sharply dressed, her smile was reserved only for certain passengers, those who, in her eyes, fit the image of who deserved first-class treatment. The Washingtons, despite paying for those very seats, clearly did not make her list. When Zara politely asked for a blanket for her younger brother, Victoria's response came clipped, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "He's old enough to manage without one." Her tone wasn't just dismissive, it was laced with condescension. Solomon caught the exchange, his jaw tightening, but he remained composed. Confrontation so early in the flight could only escalate. He reminded himself, "Choose your battles." Minutes later, Victoria returned to the row. This time, her scrutiny fell on Marcus. She eyed his toy plane as if it were contraband. "That can't be out during takeoff," she said curtly, though passengers all around them were using electronics far more distracting. Marcus, confused, held it closer to his chest. Solomon calmly interjected, "He'll put it away when the captain makes the announcement. For now, he's fine." Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't argue, at least not yet. But her glare lingered long enough to make Zara shift uncomfortably in her seat. It was a look that said, "You don't belong here." As the flight attendants prepared the cabin for takeoff, Solomon noticed something else. While others were greeted with casual warmth, "Enjoy your flight, sir," or "Can I get you a drink?" their row was passed over in icy silence. Marcus, too young to fully grasp the weight of the moment, fidgeted under the tension, asking in a whisper, "Dad, did I do something wrong?" Solomon reached over, squeezing his son's hand. "No, son. Not a thing." But the hostility didn't fade, it sharpened. During beverage service, Victoria handed out drinks with practiced efficiency until she reached the Washingtons. Without meeting their eyes, she dropped a can of soda on Marcus's tray, the liquid hissing as it nearly toppled over. "Be careful," she muttered, though it was her own carelessness that caused the near spill. Zara's protective instincts flared. "That wasn't fair," she whispered to her father once Victoria moved on. Solomon exhaled slowly. "I know. Just stay calm." Years of navigating boardrooms and negotiations had taught him the power of restraint. But he also knew that restraint could only go so far when dignity was under attack. The real shift came when Marcus, tired from the long day, began to slump against his seat. He tried to rest his head on Zara's shoulder, clutching his toy plane. Victoria returned again, her eyes narrowing at the small gesture. "Sit up properly," she barked, startling him. The command was loud enough to turn a few heads nearby. Marcus sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with confusion and embarrassment. This time, Solomon spoke firmly. "That's enough. He's a child. He's not disturbing anyone." His voice was calm, measured, but laced with unmistakable authority. Passengers glanced between him and the flight attendant, sensing the undercurrent of conflict. Victoria leaned in slightly, lowering her voice but not her disdain. "Rules apply to everyone. Even to you." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Zara looked at her father, her own anger threatening to spill over, but Solomon shook his head subtly. "Not yet." The flight continued, but the air around them thickened. Every interaction became a test, every glance a silent confrontation. Marcus shifted in his seat, unease radiating from his small frame. He had never seen adults treat his father this way. For the first time, he began to understand something his parents had shielded him from. Sometimes the world decided who you were before you had a chance to prove yourself. By the time the plane leveled in the sky, the Washingtons weren't just passengers anymore, they were targets. And all it would take was one more spark to ignite the fire. That spark was coming. The cabin was quieter now, cruising above the clouds, but the tension around the Washingtons' row hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown tighter, like a rope pulled to its limit. Marcus, exhausted, leaned his head against the seatback and reached for his soda. The can slipped slightly in his small hands, fizzing over the rim onto the tray. It was nothing more than a child's clumsy mistake. But to Victoria Reed, it became the opening she'd been waiting for. She swooped in, her voice sharp and cutting through the quiet. "Unbelievable. Can't you control him?" Her words weren't directed at Marcus, they were aimed squarely at Solomon. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the confrontation. Solomon started to respond, but before he could, Victoria reached down, snatched the can from Marcus's hands, and slammed it onto the tray with unnecessary force. The soda splashed across the boy's shirt. Marcus gasped, eyes wide with shock. And then it happened. Her open palm struck his cheek, sudden, loud, undeniable. The sound cracked through the cabin, silencing every conversation around them. Marcus froze, his small body trembling, tears springing instantly to his eyes. Zara screamed, throwing her arms around her brother as if to shield him from further harm. For a moment, the entire plane held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Solomon's heart slammed in his chest, but his face remained carved in steel. He rose slowly from his seat, towering over Victoria. The calm restraint he had carried through every slight, every insult, was gone. What replaced it was not rage, it was something colder, sharper, far more dangerous. "Sit down," Victoria hissed, her voice cracking now, betraying a sliver of fear. But she was already losing control of the narrative. Because witnesses were standing, phones lifted, cameras recorded, and the truth was no longer hers to twist. An elderly passenger, Beverly Matthews, pushed herself to her feet 2 rows back. Her voice, quivering but strong, cut through the silence. "I saw everything. And so did half this cabin." Murmurs of agreement rippled, heads nodded. A collective conscience awakened. Victoria stepped back, her composure unraveling. But the damage was done not to Marcus's cheek, though the redness was already visible, but to the system she thought would protect her. For once, the shield of silence had cracked wide open. Solomon didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. He simply placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder, his voice low enough for her to hear, but loud enough for witnesses to record. "You've just ended your career." The entire plane felt the weight of his words. What no one knew yet, not even Victoria, was that this moment wouldn't just cost her job. It would bring the entire airline to its knees. The flight landed in silence, but the silence was not relief. It was the heavy quiet of people replaying what they had just witnessed, unsure of how to process it. As the doors opened, security and airline supervisors swarmed the cabin. Victoria tried to regain her composure, her voice shrill with excuses, but the cameras told a different story. Passengers, dozens of them, stepped forward, unwilling to let the truth vanish in the chaos. Solomon didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. He carried his children off the plane with dignity, his arm protectively around Marcus, who still clung to Zara. His silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Because while Victoria thought this battle ended in the aisle of a plane, she had no idea what storm was about to follow. By the next morning, the recordings had gone viral. Millions watched the slap heard across the sky. The airline's press team scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing carefully worded statements about misunderstandings and protocols. But the story had already outgrown them. Too many witnesses, too much evidence, too much truth. And then came the revelation. Solomon Washington was not just a passenger. He was one of the most powerful figures in corporate America, a man whose voice could redirect billions. His demand was not revenge, it was accountability. Not just for his son, but for every passenger who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored when prejudice hid behind company uniforms. The airline's boardroom shook as Solomon called for reforms that reached beyond apologies, mandatory training, independent oversight, transparent reporting, the firing of not just one stewardess, but an entire chain of managers who had allowed discrimination to fester unchecked. For Marcus and Zara, the scar of that day would never fully disappear, but their pain became a catalyst. Their father turned it into power, not for himself, but for change. And as the world debated, one question lingered in every viewer's mind. If justice like this requires wealth and power, how many unheard stories are still trapped in silence?